Hello and welcome to everybody coming in for the Page Weight Playbook for Technical SEO Success. We're going to go through some very interesting stuff today, all about the technical side of web pages, what a large page impacts, and how to make it better. And you're here today with myself from Lumar. I'm the Director of Professional Services, and Dave Smart of Tame the Bots.
Hey.
If you've not heard of Dave Smart yet, you absolutely have to go and check his website out. He's a very clever guy. His name says it. You can't get out of it. Your name is Smart, so you're just going to have to deal with it.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But yeah, Dave's going to lead us through some of the concepts and ideas today. And I'm going to mostly just sit here and try and make sure nothing goes wrong on the technical side. So look forward to that. So first thing I wanted to do is a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit of introduction. So we've got a Q&A at the end. So it'd be great if you can get your questions in there and we can answer them at the end. Hopefully we'll get through them all. If we don't get through them all, we'll come back and try and answer some of them at a later date, feedback on in some way. There's a survey as well that's less than 1 minute to complete. I'd love to know what you think of this session, if it was useful, ideally if it was useful. That would be great. And of course, in a few days, it'll be shared on demand, so you can come back and have a look at it. And just to answer your question there straight away, Daniel, yeah, it will. The recording should be sent to attendees. Cool. So with that in mind, first poll question. Do you keep track of page weight on sites you manage? It's an interesting one, this, because it's not something necessarily I would do, but when you actually think about it, there's various ways that you could do this, and maybe there's better ways to do it as well. So I'm gonna get that out of the way. Apparently I'm not allowed to vote, Dave, unfortunately, and
I know, this is it.
Either.
Yeah.
Although I imagine you'd have put, we proactively monitor page, like, given that.
Yeah. Hopefully. I'd hope so. Yeah.
Cool. So I'll just move on to the next one.
Okay.
And there we go. The poll is done. That's interesting. That's about what I would have thought as well.
Yeah, I'm quite heartened by that. It looks like
yeah.
more of you occasionally take a look at least. This is good news. So we like that.
Yeah, I find that quite interesting.
Yeah.
But let's get into the meat of the presentation here. So do you want to take us in why page weight matters for SEO then?
Okay, yeah. So these are the sort of topics that we'll perhaps fly through, and then at the end we're going to have a question and answer session. So feel free to pull me up on something if I muttered or I made no sense, which I often don't, unfortunately. So I will try and keep it in human today for the joy. So let's go on to why page weight matters. Okay, so if we have a look sort of basically what happens with page weight. By page weight, just to cover what it is as a concept, it just basically means the size of all the resources. So in bytes, in megabytes, in kilobytes. The first part of it is the more a client needs to download, so client being you, your browser, you're looking at something, firstly, the longer it'll take. The other, obviously, the networks are constrained. They're not quite the same as loading something off your PC necessarily. So things have to squeeze down that wire. The bigger they are, just simple nature, the longer that's going to take. The more it'll cost your user as well. So maybe not directly SEO related, but it is something you should care about, because all that we do as SEOs, all that we do building a decent site, is to look out for your user. There's a link there at the bottom of this slide, which I believe will be shared as well. What does my site cost? And it can be very eye-opening, particularly for people on mobiles. In some territories, even things like Canada, data can be really expensive. And when you run your site through web page test, we'll also link to this. You can run it through. It can be eye-opening that sometimes you're asking people to pay maybe even $1 to look at your page. And, it comes a point where people can't always afford that, and people become, quite cognizant that they're not going to do that. The other part of it as well is that the more your browser might have to work. So much performance is about how we load stuff. But at the end of the day, if it's got to juggle a load of things as well, you make your browser work harder. And there can even be a point where your resources are so big that they're pushing stuff out of the cache, and they're making the whole experience slow. They've got to be loaded again. So it's kind of a double whammy, really. Not only is that initial hit and it's bigger and it's slowing things down, you're higher likelihood that you're asking them to do that again. It's important to remember that the impact isn't the same for everyone everywhere. Some sites have more slow mobile connection users, either, and that can even be within a demographic like in the United States, where we think everyone's going to have a super fast connection and a Wi-Fi. That might not be true if a large part of your market's in a rural area, for example, or you've got a certain demographic that has lower powered devices in general. You've got sort of quite simple mobile smartphones, entry-level things on 3G, maybe bad 4G, connecting to look at your stuff. All this page weight stuff becomes bigger and bigger and bigger hit for them. And likewise, that then goes on to signals like Core Web Vitals that do feed back into things like rankings. So again, it's perhaps more directly felt by the user, but it does have that on the other one. Like we covered, data costs, but much more in some places than others. And then fundamentally, everyone deserves a good experience on your website. And it's that kind of thing that encourages people to build the popular signals around your site and, link to it, do things, recommend it, that all pay back into SEO too. And the other point to remember as well is that search engines are clients as well. They're downloading all of this. So the more that you're shoving through, the bigger, bigger impact it is for them, the more they have to do. And while you might not really care about Google's deep pockets and how much it costs them to download stuff, they care when it comes to a point, when they're running, so many crawls all the time across the whole internet, not just your site, but even on your site. The easier you make something for them to do to access your resources, the easier it is for everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to flip it on its head there as well, Google is, as you say, a client, so they're going to crawl your site. They're going to hit lots of pages. And if your pages are quite big and you're spending a lot on your server cost per page, keep in mind that as Google spins through all these pages, it's going to be costing you more to host these files. And that can get that can be quite a significant cost when we start to talk about very big websites.
Exactly, yes.
They can quickly run into tens of thousands of dollars or pounds. So
yeah, good point. Good point, Rich. Yeah, definitely.
And the final thing, I don't know whether or not it's a good time to mention this, is about the 15 megabyte single file limit, or should we touch on that more later?
Yeah, well, you've raised it. Let's talk about it. Yeah, I mean, it's something that they've kind of added to the docs. It's Google have kind of said we've got a hard limit of 50 megabytes for any one resource. So that's your HTML or a CSS file or a JavaScript file. Now, that is huge, and it's rare you would actually come across it, but it's nice to know that there is that hard limit that it's absolutely going to fail after. So if you had a page that was longer, I remember when they first brought this out, I went to have a look who's doing that, and to be honest, it's not many. It's not something you're going to trip across a lot. I had to purposely go and look for sites that did it. I used the HTTP archive, that was great, and they were doing things like they were listings pages with images in them, and they were encoding images as data URIs. So obviously somebody somewhere had read that was a great thing to do for performance or something, kind of misunderstood. And, these were huge. I think the biggest page that I found was 60 megabytes, which is heroic and really large, but, it can happen. But I think, the 15 megabyte thing, don't think I'm under 15 megabytes and done. That's a hard limit where it's going to fail afterwards. And I think you'll hit many problems before you even got to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I've ever come across a page or something like that in the wild that wasn't deliberately intended to be that size.
Yeah,
that actually
exactly.
got
I
near
think
to that.
something's gone wrong.
So,
yeah, I think like the biggest pages, like the HTML spec, if you go and have a look at that, is a humongous page, but it doesn't even approach that.
Cool. Well, let's move on to how to identify site issues.
Sure.
and I'll leave you to explain the network
Okay.
panel.
Yeah. So if you don't know about DevTools, go and have a look about how to open your DevTools. It's a part of Chrome. And at the end of the day, Google render your pages with a version of Chrome, or at least of Chromium. It's very similar to Chrome. So it's a good way to have a look at just pure size. If you open it up and look at your page and do what's called a hard reload, so if you right click over the little reload button, you can do a hard reload. That makes sure you're loading everything not from your cache. So you can get an idea of how Google would see it, because Google kind of visits first. There's some very interesting caching stuff that we'll cover maybe in the questions and answer stuff that Google does to try and mitigate some of this. But in some ways, you've got to look at the worst case scenarios. It's the first time they've come. The size of page that they're going away. And same for your user. Is this the first time they've been to your site? Is this the impact they're going to see? So you can also do that by using the incognito mode in your browser, which basically means that you're not going off your resources and cached. So it's kind of fresh each time. If you look in the bottom of the toolbar of the network panel, you'll see how much has been transferred and how much it is uncompressed. So, for example, you'll see like 1.7 megabytes, and that's what's come across the network. That's what's left your server, come across the internet, and arrived at the browser at your computer. Then you'll see how much transferred, which will generally be a bigger figure, and that is basically uncompressed. So that's how much these things actually weigh up for all these different resources. So that's your initial HTML, that's your JavaScript, it's your CSS, it's any media. In network tools as well, you can filter the different sorts. There's a little bar at the top. There's like fetch, there's JS, there's CSS, there's images, and that will help you break down as well a little more about which types of resources are really filling stuff up. In there as well, it comes through by default in order by the waterfall. So basically, it's the order that it came through. It was requested and it arrived at your PC. You can sort by biggest and smallest just by clicking on the size column. So you can instantly find out what's the huge resources on here. Why is this page so big? What's adding up so much? Obviously, that's on a page-per-page basis. That's you sat there checking it, maybe not super scalable. So there's also Lighthouse, which is a performance set from Google. You can find that in the browser, but you can also run this as a process on a command line. You can run it through Node. You can integrate it into your build process. And that basically does a very similar test. It does avoids, and what it does is it loads your page in a browser and it has a look. And there's a test in there, avoids enormous network payloads test, which gives you the same rough kind of breakdown in KIB. It's flags if it's over 5,000, so basically 5 meg roughly. It'll actually come up and not. Otherwise, you'll have to go and dig in it. If you do the little drop downs, you can see there's test passed, and it'll give you a score. It'll come up green, even if it's under that 5,000 KIB, which is quite big. They recommend a target. If you click in the thing, they recommend a target of 1,600. 1.6 meg roughly, which is a pretty sensible target for most pages. Obviously, there's always context to everything. Some pages might need to be a little bit bigger, and smaller is always better within reason. But that's a relatively sensible target. When you're building out your CI tools, your continuous integration tools with Lighthouse or something, you can set a budget. You can tweak that. There's something that's appropriate to your site, but always try and keep it quite slim and worry about regression. So doing that kind of thing is quite a good idea. Have you come across any tools as well, Rich? Anything?
Well, I know of one tool that employs me. So Lumar has the opportunity to set a max HTML file size within its settings. So you can say we default it to be quite small, as you can imagine. Modern web pages sometimes exceed this just naturally, which is okay, but it also points to potential issues. But you can actually customize it within our tool and sort of say, well, you know, let's say we went to the extreme and said anything over 15 meg even, that's the point where I want to set the line. Then we would flag it. To be honest, at that point, we're probably timing out your pages for being too big anyway. But it's that sort of thing where the customization aspect of it is available via our tool, and it's site wide. You know, that's what we do. It's big crawls. That's the whole point.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a couple of others that I would probably look at. There's obviously Google's inbuilt stuff. That's quite often I would look in Search Console and pull files out and things like that to monitor. But
Search Console is quite a good one to look at, as well as a sniff test. You can kind of there's no direct thing in there about page size, and in there one of the things you can kind of look at is if you've got real problems, is if you're getting a lot of things like mobile friendly errors for index pages, or if you're looking at the URL inspection tool, checking pages, and if you click on view index page, and then there's a little more info panel and there's page resources there, and if you find it consistently that you're not getting things through on there, you're seeing things like other errors in there a lot, that can cover many different things. It's not always just page weight, but it is something that can happen. You know, and if you're seeing a lot of that, maybe you need to start having a look at the sizes of these resources that you're loading in.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also the crawling tools within Search Console, which is less precise, but it gives an interesting look at the overall data that Google transferred from your site. And when you look at that, quite often there's a correlation with the amount of time it took to fetch those pages. So you can sort of look at those two, and maybe something's creeped onto the site, gone site wide, whatever it is, and there's a sudden spike in that. And that can be quite a useful tool for diagnosing something that's snuck onto the website that maybe shouldn't have. Uncompressed images, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Cool. So the next one is another little poll. Do you use compression on your site? And I'm very interested to know what people sort of think about this, because generally speaking, I wouldn't necessarily expect an SEO to know what compression was out of the box, you know. But maybe a tech SEO, maybe that's unfair. This is more of a tech SEO area in general, but understanding what that is and whether or not it's on your site, that's kind of handy to know that something's on there. Just give it a little bit of time for the poll to finish.
Okay.
53% yes, so that's more than I would probably expect, to be honest. So
yeah, that's quite heartening. Yeah, this is good stuff.
But that's good. Yeah, I mean, most websites out of the box would have some form of compression, right? gzip or something, or am I maybe being a bit too presumptuous?
It depends. Is I think always the famous answer. Yes, there's sensible defaults in many things, but it really depends, because it's kind of not really thinking. Maybe if we have a look in the next slide and everything, we can
absolutely
cover some of these.
Moving on to reducing page weight.
Yeah, reducing page weight. So it is a possibility. It's not always really so much on your site, it's more on your infrastructure. So for something like text resources, and by text resources I mean it's HTML, it's JavaScript, it's CSS, it's things that are words, they're a text file. You can compress that across the wire using either, there's two ones really, there's Brotli or there's gzip. And basically how that works is your server will squeeze it down, although you can do it in other ways. Normally it's the responsibility of your web server, and that will squeeze things down using these compression algorithms. Brotli usually gives smaller file size than gzip, so it tends to be the best way forward. There's sometimes some problems as well that people don't always think about, is there's sometimes a few little steps between your server and the end user. Mostly if you're using something like Cloudflare or another CDN to serve your thing, you might be sending gzip to them. They may not necessarily be sending it to the end user. Usually they are. Usually their defaults are pretty sensible. So unless you're doing something a bit unusual, you should be getting that. But yeah, it's always worth something to check. Once again, if you have a look at the network dev tools and you click on the resource, you can see the headers that come up, the response headers, and you will see if you're using a compression in there, it'll either say gzip or say br for Brotli, basically. So you'll know that things have been squeezed down. And once again, as well, like we're looking when you were seeing the resources and you were getting those two different figures, if they're both about the same, if they're both basically the same, you're probably not compressing things too efficiently. You can go overboard, you can overcompress things. Obviously, the idea is you want page weight to be as small as possible when it's coming across the wire, but you can kind of overdo things with Brotli. You can turn it up way too high and actually make things slower, because if they're not particularly massive resources, it could be taking longer to compress them and then come across the wire and then decompress them. So you can end up with it actually being slower overall. But the defaults that are in things like web servers and a little bit of sensible tuning and looking, normally you're not going to go too far wrong with those. Obviously, as well, for things like Brotli, you're going to have to be on HTTP2 on most web servers to achieve that. And it makes sense as well. It particularly works well with caching things. So if you're doing your site's dynamic and having to zip everything on the fly for every single resource, every single time you request it, then that can be a little bit more inefficient than if you've got some server-side caching, and that's caching the already zipped version or the already compressed with Brotli version. So yeah, obviously some things like some front-end networks, some frameworks like Nux and things like that will compress things for you, and then you can serve it. If you're doing server-side stuff, they will be sending the compressed version a little. But usually it's more efficiently done at a web server level or on the CDN level. The other part as well is making sure you try and slim down that page weight, is make sure your media is well optimized. So that's things like images, video, even audio. If you've got a podcast on there, make sure that you're making that as small as possible. Reduce it down by taking it easy on the web fonts. That can make things huge. Unbelievably, it can be quite a lot of weight added to a page if you overdo it on those. The other hard thing as well is, don't forget, it's not just only what's on your page, as in terms of the HTML you've sent and designed. You might include scripts from third parties, things like pixels for measurement and other things. And they can be quite significantly weighty sometimes. And not only that, they can change as well without you noticing, because it's not your resource, it's not coming from your server, it's coming from theirs. They might decide to turn off compression, or they might decide to bloat it out with a whole load of new features or changes that you don't want. And, and obviously that can bloat things out without you even sort of realizing, which is why roughly monitoring and keeping your eye on these things is an important thing. But mostly for reducing page weight, it's just don't ship what you don't need. It's keeping it slim.
Awesome. Well, let's move on to some bite-saving approaches then.
Okay.
We don't have to if you don't want to, Dave.
No, we'll save some bytes. This is good.
we do, though. Let's be fair.
Okay, so there's things we can do to start slimming down your pages and making sure that you're trying to be as clean as possible. So for HTML, CSS, JavaScript, those text resources kind of we mentioned, is make sure you use compression. We talked about that a little bit. Make sure you are using compression efficiently for everything you've got. Make sure you minify the resources as well. So minification is basically, if you've got a big script of JavaScript, it's taking out unnecessary spaces, comma, semicolons, things that aren't actually needed, things that make it look easy and formatted for the human to read. They just aren't needed by a computer, or aren't needed by a browser. Unlike compression as well, it's kind of a free optimization once it's minified. Once it's coming down, the browser doesn't have to do any additional work to that to put it back together, unlike it does compression. So it's kind of a free optimization. Often it's not a lot saved. It depends. It can be, but it all helps. So make sure you minify those resources. HTML pages, maybe sometimes I've seen things minified to the extent where it's just one long line of text when you open it up. Maybe you've taken it a little bit too far. It would work, it would be fine, but it just makes it a little bit harder when you're trying to dive in things. But just keep it sensible. Strip out comments, strip out things you don't need. And there's libraries for this. Depending on your different how you've built your pages. If it's in JavaScript frameworks, when you're in the build process, these can minify things for you. They can minify the scripts. They can minify the CSS. Sometimes CDNs have services that can do this. Cloudflare can do this for you if you've not got the ability to do it on your server, on your side. So there's many different opportunities to minify stuff down. As well, for CSS and JavaScript, it's a case of use code splitting, or often termed tree shaking. So basically, don't just load all of the CSS and all of the JavaScript for your entire site on every single page. If you've got something that's particularly heavy, like say you've got an e-commerce website, and there's one thing that's like this really fancy customization builder thing that you could do, all kinds of marvelous things, but you don't need that on something where you just go and buy a plain version of it. Don't load that until people hit there and people, need to use that. Load it at those points. So using code splitting at that point can really be helpful. There's tools as well that you can go out there. I've got one on my site that shows you unused CSS and JavaScript. You can use, once again, DevTools has something about unused CSS, unused JavaScript. You can run a page through those, or you can load a page and it will tell you on a page, well, hold on, we're not using, you're loading this file, we're only using 1% of that. Maybe that's a good candidate that file should be split up a little bit into more appropriate things. It's never that easy a process because obviously there's some things that, CSS that's sensible site-wide, you might not use it straight away, but you're pretty sure that someone's going to use it on the journey. So maybe splitting that into a separate resource isn't quite such a good idea. But sensible balances and everything, you'll never achieve really 100% code usage for a sizable site or CSS usage, but try and head a little bit more towards that than have only 5% of what you're shipping actually ever used. Particularly with CSS, this can come in with frameworks like Tailwind or Bulmer or all these kind of CSS big things that that have every single style and everything. Often, if you don't put a build step in those, you're loading so much that you'll never ever use, so much that your users will never ever use, and it can really bloat out the page. For images, for things like for media, for images, use modern formats like WebP and AVIF if possible. That basically lets those images be smaller, but for the same quality. There's always a little bit of a play off there, but it's always a good one. Use picture or screen set, so you're serving an appropriate sized image to appropriate devices. You're not sending out a big, huge, full HD banner to a small mobile device. So using those things can really help squeeze down to those that need it the most, those mobile users on a mobile connection. And a good tip as well is optimize before uploading, particularly with images. Spending a little time before you drop it into your CMS or upload it up to your server. If you get that right and efficiently encoded and in a good format in the first place, it tends to go quite well and you've got a good control. Obviously, it's not always super scalable to do that, but it depends on the sort of site that you're running. But someone's loading those images at some point, so just drop them through something like Squoosh is an online site. If you just do a search for Squoosh app, you can drag and drop an image into your browser. It doesn't upload, it does it all in your browser. And you can have a play with different formats. You can have a play with different qualities and all kinds of different optimizations to try and get the smallest file size. But obviously, it's still got to look great because that's important. It's important that it still does its job as being a good image, but you also don't want to make more weight for it.
Awesome. We'll move on to the next couple of items.
Okay, so video is much like images. Use modern formats. WebM, use MP4 rather than an old .movi file or something. And a little bit harder to encode, although there are plenty of online tools out there that can help you get a decent image out, decent quality, decent picture. And once again, weigh off the needs of quality with performance, and strike a happy balance. Do you really need to be sending the 4K thing? Is this an IMAX experience, or is just a web page, and get them, get that balance right. And obviously then go and have an argument with the marketing and the branding department that it's not 4K IMAX, but point out to the fact it doesn't need to be, because they wouldn't see the difference on a mobile phone or a computer screen so much. If you're Netflix, it matters, but if you're just a little bit of informational, does it really need to be like that, or does it need to be with the user fast and getting that message across? And it's always a good balance to strike, and try it on your mobile phone, try it on different devices, and see what works for you and what's right. The other point as well is use something called facades. It's a good approach. So basically what you can do is, if you've got a video on the page, you can use plugins. There's quite a few out there that already do a lot of this for you. There's ones for YouTube, there's ones for Vimeo. And basically what that does is just loads the poster image. It loads like a static picture with a little pay button, but all it is just quite a lightweight image. When the user clicks on that, that's when it loads all the video in and starts doing stuff. So that's a good weight saving if your user doesn't happen to want to watch that video at that time. You're not transferring those bytes, they're not having to download those bytes. And it can also be kind of like a defer thing, that they're only adding that weight on when they need it, and it's not blocking other things as well. With fonts, once again, it's all about using sort of keeping abreast of modern formats. So it's things like WAF2, universal support now across browsers, so you don't need those old TrueType fonts so much. So make sure that your font's in that format. There are even there's free services online where you can go and convert those. You might need to check your license with the Font Foundry. Sometimes they won't let you do this kind of thing, but mostly they will. Subset the fonts as well. So basically, if you're just using a web font that's just a display one, like a header, it's got to be nice in this font, and it's always bold, only load the bold. Don't load every weight and italic and all these different kind of fonts, because it's easy to do. It's easy just to go and grab it off the net and bang it all on there, but only load what you need. If you're only going to use a few characters, you can even subset something further and just load those characters. Google Fonts lets you do that quite easily if you're loaded from there. But there's tools as well out there to help you subset fonts. If you do a search for subset, font subsetter, there's places where you can drop up there and it'll bring you, it'll deliver you back a WAF2 file with just those characters that you need. So maybe you only got uppercase letters, you're only ever going to use it for that, or maybe uppercase letters and numbers, and you can subset just for those. And that can really shave off a lot of stuff, particularly if you don't need every mathematical symbol or Greek symbol or anything. Obviously, if it's a more free form in the body of the text, maybe that's not quite so appropriate, but it can be really helpful. And like our good friend Jamie Indigo always said, remember, it's a web page and not a ransom note. You don't need Lobster and 20 other 1,000 fonts.
Although if you are writing a ransom note, please disregard.
If you're writing a ransom note, it's perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. Load as many fonts as you want.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, that kind of sums up. And what I'd like to do now is give everybody a chance to submit their questions for the Q&A. I can see we've already got a couple.
Yeah, got a couple.
I haven't checked the chat very well either. There might be one or two in there. But just before we start having a look at these, there we are. You can't see the question, so I'm going to have to read it out to you, I think, Dave. Or can you see the question?
No, I could see these questions. We've got some anonymous attendees asking a few questions.
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so
we'll answer this first one.
Cool.
Google will cache common resources across websites. How to understand what portion of the resources will get cached by bots versus loaded on the page. No, is the answer. They won't, in a way. Obviously, with browsers themselves stopped doing this. It used to be a relatively good optimization thing that if you loaded your jQuery or you loaded your web font off a certain site, everyone who went to that site, to your site, would get it if they'd been somewhere else. So they'd been to a site called jQuery of jQuery CDN. They came to your site, it would use that same resources. Now browsers don't do that. Browsers, it's kind of a security risk. It's a big problem, because if that changes, you can see, and it also gave those people ideas of they could track and monitor people across different websites. So if I was jQuery and I was serving that, I could see, oh, Joe's blog's been to that site, that site, that site, that site, that site, that site. So kind of the browsers can, no, stop that. And pretty much search engines don't do that too, at least Google, as far as I'm aware. Cache mostly from yourself. They might cache separately. They're not too clear on that. But I think basically they'll hit it as a resource for your site. Now, Google do cache very aggressively. They kind of mitigate a lot of this page weight issue, or try to, because they have to deal with this crazy web that's out there. So, obviously it's something maybe we didn't actually cover in the slides, that you should set sensible caching headers yourself. So, when someone's browsing your site, you'll say, I want, this resource, cache this, don't serve it across the network, serve it from my browser. Google pay little attention to that, really, in a way. They aggressively cache as much as they think they can get away with, because they're dealing with the web at such a massive scale. They don't need to come back and hit you again. So they do cache things, but it's hard to tell exactly what they will cache at every time. A good way to maybe do that is dig in your log files and see, when your pages are getting loaded, and also remember, they're rendered as well. So with JavaScript, see what's getting called, see what's getting hit a lot. You'll find that fairly static things like JavaScript files and CSS will probably, called relatively infrequently. It's not going to be on every page load, or probably even on every page render. Obviously, you can really screw that up if you're doing post requests. So like if you've got a JavaScript site and you use something like GraphQL and you're doing a post request to an endpoint, a post request can't be cached. So Google will need to fetch that every time. So that's always one to have a look at. But yeah, you can't necessarily predict exactly what portion, but you can have a look at your log files and gain an idea of what they're going to do, and understand that may change over time.
Is it worth mentioning AMP pages within this, or do you think that muddies the water too much, because they are the same?
Yeah, AMP's a whole kind of different thing. Same as well with signed exchanges, because basically they're caching a version of your page that's getting flirted over, but you don't know exactly when that's going to happen. And yes, it can massively save a lot of data, but not always. So it's very hard to quantify from the outside, how that will work. Particularly signed exchanges, they'll only cache it if it's a fairly relevant result and it's popping up and it's in the first few. They can't cache every single page on the net because it's just too huge. But yeah, it would save stuff, but it's hard to predict sometimes.
Awesome. I hope that answered your question, anonymous attendee.
Yes.
We've got another one from anonymous attendee, which
should we have a look at that one?
I'm going to pretend is the same person. But
yeah, okay. So what's an efficient way to load only required resources on the CMS like WordPress, considering the amount of plugins and the variety of themes available for it? It's really hard with something like WordPress. It's for something that you build that has a build step. It could be a static site that you've made. It could be a JavaScript framework. It's a little bit easier, but you can do it. There are plugins that only load the plugins in certain places. So you can say, maybe you've got WooCommerce in just a section, or you've got something that's only in another section. There are plugins that can turn on and off things on routes within WordPress. Really, a lot of it is down to how your CMS is put together and how much support there is for that within how, within the way it's built. WordPress can be quite the criminal. You can load it up with plugins that sprinkle tons and tons and tons and tons and tons. CSS, things like WordPress Rocket, there's Rocket Cache, there's a few different ones, can do some things with particularly CSS and the JavaScript. They can kind of tree shake it a little bit and at least get the critical resources and defer some of the other stuff. Ultimately, doesn't get rid of everything. But there's just things that need to be done for that. Manually go through a few of your different pages. Obviously with CMSs, they're often templated. You've only got a few types of pages. Go and have a look at your different templates, see what's loading and what you actually need, and then you have to deal with it kind of on a template level, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think WordPress is probably the most challenging one that I've encountered anyway, to actually keep control of more than anything else. It's not that it's worse than any of the others. It's just there's so much variety available. It's very easy to bloat it out.
That's it. By its nature, it's flexible, and that's a blessing and a curse. Okay, should we move on to the next one?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ahmad here has asked, can a CDN be an ultimate solution for JS, CSS scripts that cannot be deleted due to their need on other templates?
It depends what you mean by ultimate solution, really. I mean, you can do all kinds of clever things on the edge with CDNs these days. You can strip certain things out from certain areas by path. There's a whole world of edge CDNs, and obviously CDNs can help you squeeze things down, and they can also help you serve things nearer to your user, which isn't really page weight, that's more page speed. So it can mitigate some things, but ultimately it's not going to solve it. And one of the big problems as well with doing lots of things on the edge as opposed to dealing with it at source is sometimes it gets forgotten about. Different teams can be involved. It can confuse things. So you need careful coordination with your DevOps team and your developers. If you're doing things like stripping stuff out on the CDN on certain routes, you need to make sure the developers understand why and where it's coming from. So it can, but I always prefer try and deal with it at source. So I hope that answers that.
Awesome. And then another one from Ahmed here. So WebP images are large in size. What is the Sorry, go on.
Generally no.
I think that was a question, perhaps.
Yeah. But, so they can be. You can make a very large WebP, just like you can make a very large JPEG. Generally it compresses a little bit better than other ones. Other things to watch out for. I mean, obviously you'll see people do things like put a photograph in a PNG, and PNG is really bad at that kind of thing, and WebP is a little bit better at at both. But yeah, there's no reason a WebP should be bigger. Normally it should be smaller than the equivalent, say JPEG. And once again, drop it in something like Squoosh and have a play around with the settings there and see quite how small you can get it while it's still looking good. AVIF can be a bit smaller, but it isn't always smaller, particularly for things that are more sort of on the ping side of things. So WebP can sometimes outperform it. And AVIF it's not universal. I think it might be now in Safari, but there might still be some older ones. So there still might be some browsers that don't support AVIF. So WebPing is a good one to fall back to. And there can still be certain sort of images that do better in one format than another.
That's a good point as well. Yeah, and actually that kind of leads me on to a question that I want to ask, which is, what is a good way to optimize images?
Obviously, there's a scalable solution. Doing them one at a time maybe isn't going to work. there are CDNs that specialize in doing imagery. There's Cloudinary, there's a few out there. Some CMSs can optimize images for you. WordPress does it a little bit, and a lot of the other ones, I think Sanity might have something, but I know there's a few different ones. I'm a fan of a headless one called Directus that I use, and that's got some pretty good image capability in it. And basically, the CMS can handle it for you. It can upload it. You can do it in batch with something like Sharp, which is powers behind Squoosh. Or you can use one of these, something like Cloudinary or something, which basically you just throw your images at it. When your browser when a user's browser requests it from that CDN, it will say, oh, great, this supports WebP and it's about this size. So it'll just handle all that optimization for you. Obviously, that's very scalable. Obviously, it doesn't always do the absolute best job, but maybe you could eke a few more bytes out of it doing yourself. But sometimes life's too short, and sometimes that's a great scalable solution. So these things are quite handy. It's like I say, there's plugins as well for frameworks. Both Next and Nuxt have an image plugin that can help you with things like resizing the images, putting them into picture formats, into picture elements. So there are a lot of tools that help you hold your hand out there that can be a bit more scalable. Video, there's not so much out there for videos, more of a manual process. I suspect more and more as more people use video resources, maybe one of these services will come along and start doing that for you as well.
Yeah, I imagine a service already exists within a proprietary server, like something like TikTok, for example. They probably have something.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're not willing to share it because they spent a lot of money developing it, of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, nonetheless. Awesome. So one's just come in here from William. Hi,
hello, William.
Yeah, I was going to say hi. 50% of mobile users are on sub $300 devices. Should SEOs think about mobile device processing power when thinking about page weight, which is an interesting alternate to it? So
they should. My answer is yes, they should. It's kind of, it depends on how you class SEO. Directly as a crawling thing, obviously no, because Google use their infrastructure. They don't use a $300 device, but users do, and users feed into Core Web Vitals, and users are the ones that use your site and recommend it. So yeah, they really should. It's always humbling to have a look at your demographics and try and get hold of a device similar, or even use the DevTools or something like Lighthouse to slow down your CPU and your connection speed to throttle things basically, and have a look how maybe some of your users are actually seeing your site, and it can be not so great. And and like William said here in the question, a huge, if you're really amping up the amount that you're compressing things with Brotli or something to the absolute top, and it's taking all this time to then unzip on the other side, have you actually saved anything, or have you actually made things worse? And zip can't save everything. It doesn't make the weight entirely disappear. It makes it transfer a little faster, but it's still on that device. And the lower powered device, the less memory it has available, the less memory it has to keep things in cache. And it's like I say, it's particularly on these lower end devices, and we think of them as lower end devices, but it's surprising that they're just devices for many people. We work in an industry that's tech orientated. We've probably got, a relatively modern smartphone, we've probably got a fairly decent laptop. We're probably not on some old tablet somewhere, but your users might well be. So always have a look at your analytics, see, what demographic are my users? Are they all on that? I mean, likewise, if you're only ever getting, everybody coming to your site and they're using great, connections and great devices, maybe you've got a little more headroom there. But always try and look at your common denominator, try and look at who's really looking at your site. So it's a great question, a great point from William.
I actually have an example recently of where we were doing a Core Web Vital analysis of a website, and they had the same code base across multiple countries, yet the score from one particular country was significantly worse than a less typical country of which they'd sell through. And the code base is the same, so there's not a lot to sort of pull out there. So we're looking at
Yeah.
scripts and add scripts and things like that.
Yeah.
And then we had the idea to break it down by demographic, and the demographic was significantly different. And the devices that and the internet that was available to the demographic was
Yeah.
not the same. So therefore,
Yeah.
we got a worse score with Vital Score.
Yeah.
And I thought that was fascinating, but also indicated
Yeah.
you've got to be on the ball about this stuff. It's not as simple as,
Yeah.
oh, that's a good score, now we're done. It's a live score. It's a score that's based
right.
on
Yeah.
users.
Yeah.
So,
And,
yeah.
you know, when you begin to tune to that level as well, there are things you can do. You can get client hints, so you can see the estimated connection speed. You can see the device memory capabilities. There's also, they may request save data. Save data is a thing. So you can look for those headers as well. Obviously, that's a little bit more advanced stuff than just generally tuning your site, but you can tailor the experience to the user as well then. You know, if you know that that person's got a low powered device with hardly any memory and, you know, really slow connection, maybe don't send them that massive video. You know, maybe they don't need that. Maybe that's not the most important thing for them. So those are really useful things, not directly for search engines that don't send out those headers, but once again, for your users, it can be really helpful.
Awesome. Right, there's still a little bit of time left if anybody else has another question, but I do have another one that I put to one side. You can tell I'm a slick presenter. How do you measure page weight?
Well, I think, yeah, I suppose we covered that a little bit in the things, but I do think it's good to spot check. It's good to get those dev tools open and have a look yourself and start spot checking. But I really think you should build something into your pipeline. You should build something systematic. So that can be using something like Lighthouse or another tool to run a scan on maybe a selection of pages. Many sites, you know, are templated out. They've got maybe a category page or an article page or a product page, and, you know, certain types of pages. So pick a few of those. Don't try and look at every page on your site every day. You know, if you've got a huge site, once again, that's not scalable. But pick a few good representative examples of each template type. Run something like Lighthouse on a script and look at that. And, you know, set up some reporting so that if you see a regression, you know to go and have a look why. It could be that, you know, maybe the compression's got turned off, or maybe somebody's dropped a bunch of images in and they've not optimized those. And, you know, it's an ongoing process. And, you know, but basically I would always do it that way. I would set up something, different sorts of template on your site, and then just something that you run every couple of days or every week. Obviously, if you've got a build process, if you're building a site, if it's something like that, that's something you can build into that pipeline of when the site's getting built, ready to go to production. And you can see the page weight there. You can set a budget. And if you see regression in that, then it's time for an investigation. Maybe don't just push it live. Maybe have a look at what's going on there and fix it before it goes live.
Awesome. That's amazing. Cheers, Dave. We're just about to wrap up, but there was something in the chat which I thought was very interesting. Is there an AI tool to check page weight? Now, there's an AI tool for pretty much everything, but I don't know how refined the output would be at this time. I think it's still in the learning phase, it feels like.
I think so. Yeah. I don't know if there's any necessarily AI tool, and I'm not sure there'd be a massive benefit to an AI tool because the weight's the weight. Yeah. Maybe there'll be things that help you spot what's heavy and what needs to be fixed, but, you know, it's kind of such a thing with such metrics attached to it. It either is heavy or it isn't, that AI might muddy the water.
Yeah. So thanks for the interesting question though, Satish.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'll move on to the little extra information that we have on here. So when this deck is provided out, you'll be able to click on all these links and dive into these individual blogs and things like that. I just wanted to make you aware of what is available as part of follow-up material in this area. It's a very deep area. There's a lot of interesting discussion around quite individual bits, and none of that detracts from the core fundamentals, but also there is there's some very cool stuff out there that you could potentially look at doing.
Definitely. That I just like to point, just highlight, go and have a read of the page weight chapter of the Web Almanac, which is on there, which is a link before you go in there. Get my dig in first. I wrote that with Jamie Indigo, was the lead author on that. So it's an excellent, it kind of dig a bit of a deeper dive into some of the metrics and some of the things that we found out there. So it can be, you know, quite an interesting read on the theoretical and the technical side of things.
Awesome. Yeah, highly recommend it. Both Jamie and Dave are amazing. So fully recommend anything that they do. And if they're working together, doubly so. Cool. And I'll sum it all up by saying thank you very much. Thank you for everybody who popped in, everybody who asked the question and shared the time with us. It's been great fun. And thank you very much, Dave.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. Thank you for having me along. It's been great.
Cheers, Will.